Hi, King Dan here. This video is called Hindsight 2020, a Constitutional Crisis. I think that the Constitution proposed by Hyunjin is a really cool document. I even wrote a book on it, but that was until I began to question the fruits I saw as a result of the Jamal vs. Lourdes case. Jamal vs. Lourdes. The Constitution was used in an attempt to protect the children of God against someone who was in a servant or public servant position. I'm obviously not going to get fully into the case. You can watch the series on the exact details, but the end result were that there were clear violations of due process that did occur, and it demonstrated the ineffectiveness of the Inspector General. Now, that was important because for some of us, that revealed a clear atmosphere of spiritual reversal of dominion. Second, it revealed the relativistic kingship culture around and with Hyunjin. Several examples that I can easily point to is following Hyunjin ends up being equated to following father, and then respecting lineage ends up meaning you're respecting Hyunjin. And then coming from father's lineage, like the Constitution comes from father's lineage, is again equated to coming from father. You can watch my Kingship Relativism 101 video for more details on that one. But ultimately, 3, it led to questioning the spirit of the proposed Constitution. And this is important because the Bible explains we're not fighting flesh and blood. We're fighting principalities of darkness, including in the heavenly realms. Office of Inspector General. So this position, the Inspector General, represents an archangelic position. Okay, it's a servant position. It's a governmental role similar to a president or a Speaker of the House, and its primary responsibilities end up being to audit or inspect the actions of government, to find violations in process or law. Now, it's important to understand that the position of Inspector General is categorically different than that of the King of Kings and his children. So naturally, his children are going to be in a direct relationship. The children of God have lineage and have a relationship with him. But when you move into an employment-based position, you end up becoming a servant of God, of which all the children of God have authority over you simply because of lineage. Now, you might be thinking, wait, isn't Kukjin the physical son of True Father? Doesn't he hold lineage? Well, yeah, when he's not in the capacity of Inspector General. When you go to work, you're actually working in a servant position to whoever owns that company. The owner is the one in the Adamic position. So what this ended up revealing is that the Office Inspector General has an issue. The issue is the citizens are provided no oversight capabilities over the Inspector General. In a sense, there's a public servant that is completely unaccountable to the people, which are the children of God. You might have heard the expression, who will regulate the regulators? Well, in this case, the same idea applies as who will audit the auditors when the auditors aren't even doing their defined responsibility. If you consider yourself a co-heir with Christ, then the natural answer would be all citizens, including a successor, would have the same authority over all of government. In this case, however, the way the Constitution is designed, the Inspector General remains solely accountable to the representative of King of Kings. Now, that would be great if the representative actually did his responsibility. But if you look at the Jamal vs. Lourdes case, the roles ended up being reversed, where it was the Office of Inspector General telling the king what to do. Either way, we still have the same problem. There's a position of government that does not remain accountable to the people. So I started looking at the amendment process to see, is there anything we can do to solve that clear problem? No amendments. And then I realized this was not only a spiritual kind of battle, but this was a very logical fallacy that ended up being exposed because of the Inspector General. So the first fallacy is citizens have a voice in, but not over government. What I mean by that is that citizens are given a role in the democratic process to create laws, but they actually have no authority over the process itself. It's outlined for them via the Constitution. There's an implicit inherent distrust and actually a disrespect for the co-heirs with Christ in this circumstance. Now, I don't blame Hyunjin for having an inherent disrespect for people. Imagine if your mom ended up becoming the whore of Babylon. But still, that's not his call. Our rights and civil rights and our ability to have dominion over creation comes from God simply by all of us being a child of true parents. And the second thing I figured out is that having no amendments is actually an imposition on the people themselves, not on the government. It's telling the people what they can or cannot do with their own government. This imposition ends up assuming a political power or right in kingship that is not also inherent to every other citizen. Essentially, to believe this Constitution can have no amendments, you must believe in unequal rights. The third thing I realized was a popular phrase you hear: the amendments were the result of the sin of slavery. But this is a really easy guilt trip. What you're saying is we have to ban amendments so that we limit the size of government. Well, then we have to ban firearms to limit the murders. But a firearm, like an amendment, can go both ways. Amendments can increase the size of government, but they can also be used to become more aligned to the true underlying principles of freedom, just like a firearm can be used for murder, but also to save a life in self-defense. Ultimately, this is a guilt trip because what it's doing is it's putting you in the mind of the person listening to this and the person believing this, is it's saying, if you believe in amendments, you must believe in slavery. The fourth thing I recognize is that banning amendments ends up thwarting the societal debate over key political issues. This is different than God letting Adam and Eve have free will and the potential to fall. Since you end up cutting off this societal debate and really the voice of society at large, it ends up asserting an authoritarian spirit of freedom that makes this assertion versus actually going into society and changing the culture directly. This is a classic example of ends justifies the means. The last point really is the worst point. No amendment ends up relativizing Christ with the kingship position. So you make a distinction between father to Hyunjin, from Hyunjin to Shinjun, and Shinjun to the next generation to infinity. But since in this case, Hyunjin declared this constitution into existence with no amendments. It's not, father didn't say that. That was Hyunjin. Don't relativize father with son. Okay? So actually, Hyunjin can completely declare this constitution out of existence. It's Hyunjin's call, if you will. But if you believe a kingship is passed down, then you must also believe in equal authority of every kingship down the line. If Hyunjin can declare something, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth kingship can undeclare that same thing. That ends up becoming a death spiral for relativism, because then it's the opinions of whatever kingship number you're on. It loses the absolute standard where every single kingship honors and respects Christ. The writers are not important. Several years ago, back in fall 2016, I took a class taught by Tim Elder, not really because I cared to understand the politics of the Constitution. That's really simple. But I wanted to understand the context and spirit behind the Constitution. In that class, I have notes, which I have a habit of taking because I'm really not actually that smart, that my notes say, what's important is that Hyunjin declared the Constitution. The writers are not important. Now, I remember when Kukjin said this, I thought that was really strange, but I had no reason to distrust Kukjin at the time. But it wasn't until I had to question my presuppositions that I realized how really nefarious the spirit was. Just take this statement and contrast the spirit versus the writing and the founding of the United States Constitution and other documents like the Declaration of Independence. All those people ended up signing a document, writing a document, signing their name, knowing that their lives were on the line. But in this case, the writers are not important. And since he didn't come out and say that Hyunjin wrote the Constitution, which would have solidified that, you have to imply that Hyunjin may not have wrote the Constitution. So the creation of the Constitution was held in secret, which by itself really conflicts with the High Noon culture if this is such an important constitution. The way I see it, there are three possible options. Hyunjin Moon created the Constitution, and if that's the case, we again have to go back to evaluate kingship relativism. I mentioned it in the last slide with the amendments. Basically, it's relativistic. If Hyunjin did not create the Constitution, then we would have an issue where we would have a de facto Supreme Council of some other group of person, whether it's one person, 10 people, doesn't really matter. Who is this Supreme Council that gets to decide the rules and laws that all of us apparently have no real true say in? Okay? And then the third point is that if Kukjin created the Constitution, then we have to again evaluate that whether or not the younger is following the older, whether Hyunjin Moon is following Kukjin Moon, because there's warnings from father to say that the younger should not follow the older. You can watch my video, Cain and Abel United, on that issue specifically. At some point in this video, people are going to be triggered and say, oh, it's about the heart. We need unity. Well, that's all true, but God's kingdom is also logical and orderly. Father's words. The first discrepancy I saw with Father's words is here in this first paragraph. Once that successor is determined, the law or constitution of the heavenly kingdom shall be laid down to guide all activities. Sanctuary supporters and Hyunjin himself like to refer to this, passage from 1983 and say, look, the successor will lay down the Constitution, right? The Constitution will come from Christ's kingship. But that's not what this is saying. This is just saying that once the successor is determined, then the Constitution will be released. It doesn't say that the Constitution will be released by the successor. The second paragraph goes, the 4-year presidential term limit should be changed to an 8-year term. If you notice the source speech, coronation ceremony of the kingship of God in 2001, this is actually in the very same speech that the writers of the Constitution used as the framework for Hyunjin's Cheongguk Constitution. I brought this up with Tim Elder at the time, and he said he'd look into it, but the next class, he really just blew off the question, and he gave some excuse probably about translation. But if these are Father's words, at the time, I remember thinking how strange not even to take that into consideration. All right, 3. Outline of the Heavenly Constitution back in 2009, and in this particular speech, Father actually lists out the 5 points for the Heavenly Constitution. I encourage you to read this one for yourself, but basically in the speech he's talking about uniting the spiritual, physical worlds, the era after the coming of heaven, and living a transparent life, and working through the Able UN, the UN, etc., and even, creating a harmonious world through blessed culture marriages. It's really different topics than a political constitution, but I think Father's words really need to be at least grappled with. The fourth point says the Constitution for the Kingdom of God is completely ready, and he did this back in 2011. Now, at this point, I do want to say Father talks a lot about the national constitution or the constitution for Cheongaguk, and he often references his books like the Cheongseongyang. So when he's talking to his children and he's talking about his constitution, he's talking about his words, okay? But again, there's a flippant spirit here with Sanctuary and Hyunjnim, where they're always talking about a political constitution. To say that Father did not complete the constitution during his lifetime, which Hyunjnim has said, really does a disservice to Father's words. I mean, he says it right there. The last point is one I saw this past week as I'm reading through the Cheongseongyang, and it says, if a judge serves for 10 years, he will get sick and die. If he does not die, he will at least become seriously ill. Now, in Hyunjin's constitution, judges do have term limits just like everyone else, and they have a term limit of 12 years. So if we want to honor Father's words, then we should at least consider making the judges on the Supreme Court a 10-year term versus a 12-year term. Now, does that mean in Hyunjin's constitution he doesn't mind if people get sick and die? I mean, that's an implication from this. I don't think he means that. But again, it goes back to Father finished everything. Now, pretending that Father's constitution was passed along through a successor who makes declarations like no amendments, and then clearly has problems directly with Father's words if you read some of these statements, I think we have to come together as a community to really grapple with what Father actually has been saying versus what we've been hearing Father has said. In my opinion, Father left behind the internal constitution. That's his textbooks. But it was up to us to end up grappling with this external constitution. And when I say us, I mean all of us, convincing each other and the rest of society what God's political vision looks like. Now, that's us grappling with it in a cultural sphere, not just accepting what Hyunjin has to offer. Hindsight 2020. For those of you who appreciate the free market, I was thinking, well, a true political culture is basically just the scientific process over the evolution of political understanding. You don't just end up with a constitution that can't fall because someone says so. The actual application of political principles in society is where, in the first sub-bullet, it says, discover deeper application of political principles. You deal with this on a society level, let's say property rights. You extend the idea of property rights into different areas of society, and you start to learn more and more and more about the specifics of that one issue. And as you're dealing with that one issue, you uncover misapplication, not necessarily out of malicious government intent, but just out of this, false hypothesis of political principles. So in this scientific process, really all you're doing is saying, oh, you discovered a better application or a deeper application of a political principle, and so you then alter the Constitution and or its processes and laws to greater align with the discovered principles. Because you can't say you know everything right now. You can't say that this is a perfect constitution. It wasn't created by Father, even though people like to think so. Case in point is actually the second point. 8 technical corrections have already been incorporated. It's been a while since the technical corrections were put into place, and I actually was kind of helping because there were some that I found. But if you really think about it, a technical correction is just a de facto amendment basically. And the person who ended up being responsible for making these technical corrections was Kukjin. So that implies no amendments unless your name is Kukjin. It's a double standard. The amendment doesn't exist, but really just not for you. The third point is that other logic or grammatical errors have been already found. I'm currently aware of 3 other errors, 1 in the preamble and 2 within the Constitution. I listed the one here in the preamble. So the preamble does not acknowledge True Father's establishment of Cheonggyeok. Since the preamble does not fight from the victory, then it fails to acknowledge the establishment of Cheonggyeok, and so it says something to the effect of a future nation of Cheonggyeok will be established legally and politically. And then if you even think about that logic, it means as soon as that nation would be established, then the preamble would be wrong because the preamble is always talking about a future nation. So it's a loopy logic. Now, with all that said, most of the technical corrections, amendments, are not actually substantive in nature, but some of them are. But either way, this Constitution and preamble does not fight from the victory and does not inherently respect the God-given civil rights of the children of God. Points to ponder. Why does everyone say True Father's successor would release the Constitution? What other items are potentially invalid within the Constitution? Would the spirit behind the Constitution invalidate the entire Constitution? What is the proposed Constitution actually promoting if it's not freedom? Does the Constitution exemplify communist ideology in the era of Fourth Adam? Does the spiritual authority of the Constitution equal that of Family Fed's Constitution? Could the USA Constitution eventually recognize true parents via the amendment process? Now that would be ironic, wouldn't it? Are there other actions of authority by Hyunjin Moon that need reevaluation? In my opinion, which is just an opinion, don't get offended, the writers of the Constitution are at best completely immature and irresponsible. However, a strong case can be made that this is a tyrannical document meant solely to subjugate the children of God.